Very often I'm asked by people, Bobbie, who is your favorite interviewer? And I am happy to say that I'm seated here with my favorite interviewer because, David, I have frequently answered that I just think you're one of the very best and certainly my favorite interviewer.
Well, bless you for saying so. That's lovely. Let me return the compliment by congratulating you on your award for excellence. It's terrific.
Yes, given by the Toastmistress, and I'm very, very honored indeed. But we didn't really come here to slap one another on
Well,
the back.
it's a nice way to start a conversation. Excuse us, won't you? We're just having a good time over here.
Yes, but David, I really did want to talk with you as one broadcaster and one interviewer to another because, in a way, I think that perhaps we must have a similar philosophy about interviewing. Have you ever really tried to identify your philosophy?
Well, I think that's a good question because I think in one sense it is instinct to a great extent. I mean, you know when to pull. Silence is golden, which it can be sometimes, and when it's embarrassing, which it can be sometimes. And then again, I think at the same time it's a question. Well, I think the key thing really of all is to have been born be fortunate enough to have been born with a fairly insatiable sense of curiosity, and then to enjoy listening to people, because I'm sure you've sometimes been interviewed yourself by people who don't listen, and you feel like saying, and then of course I married the Pope's first wife, because they're going to say, what is Britain's attitude to the common market? I mean, they just don't listen. And of course the joy of doing this sort of thing is listening, because people say surprising things and it interests you, and you must follow it up.
And the thing is that very often with the students, they'll say, gee, how do you remember all those questions? And I say, if you'll listen, the next question is always there.
That's right. And you have a sort of clipboard maybe or something like that, but really, mentally or metaphorically, you like to chuck it away, and go with whatever happens. Most recent example, I was in Australia, and a country I fell in love with, and I was interviewing the Prime Minister, Gough Whitlam. Now, he's one of the wittiest politicians you could ever wish to meet, and within seconds it was back and forth, and all the notes and questions, the facts weren't forgotten, but I mean all the notes and specific areas were forgotten, you know what I mean? And that's an interviewer's dream come true, isn't it, really?
Another thing I've always observed about you, David, is that now I am not a performer, never have been, but you're a performer and a darn good one because I've seen you and we all remember you from That Was the Week That Was. But in the interview situation, you're always able to play down the performer instinct, and that's a problem that some performer interviewer people have.
It's very important, I think, that not to be all the while looking, hey, I've got that funny ad lib I want to get in, because the best jokes always come out of what the person's just said, invariably. That conversation with Whitlam, but a million others that I can think of, the best jokes come out of the interplay between two people anyway, And if, as you say, you're thinking, all the while that the person's talking, what can I get in now? You won't hear something stunning. I was on a radio program in London the other day, and a man was supposed to say what was the upcoming most interesting television program. And the guy who's interviewing him was obviously thinking, what shall I say at the end of this, and not listening to what the guy said. And the guy said, well, I recommend to all your listeners, whatever his name was, that in the next week the best program is this program on life and birth and so on. Though at the same time, I must also add that there's one other outstandingly publicised program this coming week called something else or other, which I really recommend to all your listeners to steer clear of. It's really the most boring thing I've ever seen. Now, the guy interviewing said, well, I'll certainly make sure not to miss that. Now, he was obviously answering the first half of what the guy said, not the second. You know what I mean? And that's always disaster, because the last thing someone says may be the most interesting.
Yes.
I suppose I would pick a glorious island, not too big, a glorious island with its own water supply, cut off, not from the world, but cut off from any other island, surrounded by water, surrounded by sandy beaches. Scorpios is beautiful, but an island perhaps two miles by 2 miles, with sandy beaches all the way around, because going back to my childhood, sand means holidays to me, Yes, an island.
And who would you take with you to your island?
Well, there's a number of very delightful candidates at the moment.
I'm sure of that.
I just bought a present for one of them, and now I've got yes, just bought a very nice present.
David, you know we're both going to be in a lot of trouble if we don't at least refer to that
Well,
marvelous book, because it's the book that has brought you to the Neiman Marcus fortnight.
Absolutely. The book is actually, and quite seriously, I mean, I bought a book something like this because I bought this book for myself. I'm very proud to have it, and I've given it because it's a glorious present to people. I bought another book here because obviously I have these books at home, but this is something that I've just fallen in love with because old books, and this is one of a limited edition of 500, and the first 75 copies, numbers 1 to 75, are here at Neiman Marcus for people.
And it's Chaucer's Canterbury Tales.
Exactly, and it's the original. I don't know whether they can see it at home, but it's the original print by Caxton of 500 years ago there, and the whole reproduction has been put together with a genuine goat skin, and that's real gold, and then inside it's numbered, each one is numbered, so that it's clear there are 500 copies, and these early numbers are particularly valuable. And it comes from the Pepys Library at Cambridge, which is where this stunning old edition is. And the exciting thing is, when these 500 have gone, there'll be no more, and then the market in them will begin, and the value of them will go up, and so on.
David, I'm grateful for the book, and I'm grateful for the time that you've spent with us today.
Well, I'm really delighted to talk about old books on this modern medium we both love, called television. And thank you for the welcome I've had in Dallas.
Reviews that you've had, David, is there one that is particularly outstanding?
Gosh, that's a difficult one. I think really, in the inspirational area, the late Senator Robert Kennedy or Christy Brown, the paralyzed Irish author. In the area, for instance, of confrontation, I've had some memorable confrontations. One was with Charles Gary, the lawyer for the Black Panthers, who came up with this absurd statistic about 29 Panthers being systematically murdered by the police, which turned out to be nonsense. Or a confrontation I once had with Christian Barnard, or talking to two Nazi war criminals at various times, once Albert Speer and once Boulder von Schirach. And he was the head of the Hitler Youth, he was the Gauleiter of Vienna, and he actually said to me once, he said, in this interview, he said, do you know what we did when we were imprisoned in Spandau for 20 years? And I said, no, of course I don't. He said, we grew tomatoes, Mr. Frost, and do you know what happened to those tomatoes? I said, well, of course I didn't know what happened to those tomatoes. He said, we were not allowed to give them to the old people of Spandau because they had been grown by the war criminals. So do you know what happened to the tomatoes, Mr. Frost? I said, of course I didn't know. He says, they were taken out and burnt. And then he leant forward to me. Now, this is the head of the Hitler Youth, the Gauleiter of... And he said to me, do you know what happened when we were in Spandau, Mr. Frost, for 20 years? And I said, well, of course I don't know what happened. Well, what did I? He says, we grew tomatoes, Mr. Frost. That's what we did. We grew tomatoes. And do you know what happened to those tomatoes? And I said, well, of course I don't know what did happen to them. He said, we were not allowed to give them to the old people of Spandau because they had been grown by the war criminals. So they were taken out and burnt, Mr. Frost. Burnt. And then he leant forward to me. Boulder von Schirach, head of the Hitler Youth, Reichsführer of Vienna, responsible for all that death. He leant forward and said to me, quite seriously, Mr. Frost, do you know what it can do to a man to have his tomatoes burnt? Isn't that extraordinary? Just at the end of all that, he still, after 20 years in Spandau and everything, had no comprehension of the issues that were involved in World War II. But then those are the experiences that you can't pay for, to hear things like that. And they have to add something to your own knowledge of what makes people tick. I mean, someone did a documentary on me while I was in Australia last time, and they took a phrase out of an interview that I'd said, and I didn't know I'd said it. And they called the interview, they called the whole program, the documentary about me, What Makes People Tick Fascinates Me. That's what it was called, the story. And that's true, really. I mean, and that's what you and I have to be born with, the interest in what makes people tick.
David, have you ever had a kind of fun question that you would ask people and ask that same question of a number of people?
I've asked lots of people, yes, what is your definition of love? How would you like to be remembered? I've asked a lot of people. I once was asked that myself. Actually, there was a whole group of students, and a student over there shouted out, "Mr. Frost, what would you like to be remembered for?" And someone over there, before I could answer, shouted out, "Ever," which I thought was a pretty good answer.
A question that I've asked lots of people, I'll ask you the same one, David, is that if you could have anything in the world and money were no object, but it had to be some tangible thing, excluding peace and love and this kind of
Health
thing.
and all that
Yes.
stuff.
What would you choose?
One tangible thing. Well, some of those things I've just seen that Stanley Marcus was showing me were pretty remarkable. Some of those Chinese vases downstairs, and so was the price too. But although I'm sure they were great value. Now, what would I pick? That's interesting. A tangible thing, because I'm not a great. I could say, I suppose, my own jet or my own 707 or something, since I fly so much. But on the other hand, I find that I usually fly BOC, and they look after me so well that I really think the trouble of actually having to organise your own plane would be worse. Do you know what I mean? So that doesn't work, does it?